Hi, I'm Esther.
And I'm Sean.
I write about AI news here at Tech Target.
And I edit Esther's stories.
We're here to talk to tech experts about everything AI, from open and closed models to AI agents and who's ahead in the generative AI race.
And even the elusive AGI.
We've got it covered, right, Sean?
Yep, we've got it covered.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Targeting AI episode. Today, Varun Singh from Moveworks joins us. Varun is the president and co-founder of Moveworks. Moveworks describes itself as the agentic AI co-pilot for employees. Before Moveworks, Varun worked at Meta and later Sephora. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Varun, can you describe what led you to find Moveworks? You worked for Meta for a couple of years right before that. So, how did the idea of Moveworks come about?
It's a great question. I think so. Just to give you a sense of where we started, the company started in 2016. So this was almost 10 years ago, before the moment of ChatGPT and before we are today. And AI was a very interesting idea for folks in niches and pockets. And for me, I think the journey to think about AI more deeply started actually at the first company where I was an early employee at Sephora. And the problem that we dealt with there was a lot of sellers and sales reps who would get on calls with customers. And each of them had to be trained every time to ask the right questions to understand what the customer's needs were and whether they're a good fit for our product or service at that time. This was in 2013, 2012 timeframe. And I wondered if there was like an efficient way to take in customer data and recommend to each seller who's interacting with customers what questions they should ask. And that was my first ever interest in AI. Like, AI is something that can personalize a seller's ability to engage with customers at scale. But I didn't know anything about it. This was in 2012. AI wasn't a big thing. And I thought about where I could go to learn more about AI. And that's when I sort of joined Meta. And in Meta, my responsibility, I was in the product management org, and my responsibility there was to help scale Facebook more efficiently and effectively. And it was called Facebook then, so I might interchange the two words. But to scale Meta more efficiently and effectively. And just to give you context, when I joined Meta, there were about 7,000 employees, which is about less than a tenth of how big they are today. They were growing rapidly. And there was a lot of different bottlenecks that needed to be solved. And I'll go through some of them and how that led me to this idea. One was Facebook had a lot of employees that were excited to bring other employees, other of their friends to Facebook. And one idea we had was, well, how can we allow employees to refer candidates more effectively? And when we observed that flow, we were like, well, one of the challenges that employees have is they don't know who would be a good fit for roles at Facebook, who amongst their network would be good. So what we did there was we looked at profiles of employees' friends and friends of friends and used that to recommend which of these employees would be useful fits or would be, could possibly be good fits for roles at Facebook. So we built this internal tool for referring candidates. And the interesting thing here was Facebook at that time was inventing new language modeling techniques. And one of the techniques they had was this thing called, I forget the name now, but it was essentially around understanding topic classification of text or posts, which was predominant at Facebook. So we applied that technique to resume classification and built this referrals product. Another area, so this gave me a sense of, with natural language understanding, you can understand large blobs of text and make recommendations against. It was a traditional classifier approach. The second thing to me was, Facebook at that time was growing rapidly, but what was more surprising was how fast WhatsApp and Messenger were growing. And it was evident to us within Facebook that messaging was going to be a bigger use case, especially in a world where a lot of people don't download new applications and they just want to engage with their networks using messaging. And on the enterprise side, if you recall, Slack was growing extremely fast. And in the enterprise, I'd noticed that people hadn't stopped downloading applications. There was a lot of promise, if you recall, with mobile apps in the enterprise. And outside of messaging applications, nothing really got traction. So I felt that on the messaging layer, writing on something like Slack, when you combine natural language understanding with it, you could build a front door for many different applications and allow employees to engage with underlying workflows and applications. So we started building applications like that for interviewers internally at Facebook. Facebook had tried to build internal mobile apps that were very powerful, but it was very hard to get adoption and engagement. So when I built that, we built some of the first earliest bots for interviewing, helping interviewers become more efficient at Facebook. And combining these two ideas, I figured out that there's an opportunity in the enterprise to do something meaningful by allowing employees to get connected with workflows and data using the power of messaging and using the power of natural language understanding or language models. But what I didn't know was what the problem would be. What's the right kind of problem to solve? The technology opportunity was clear. And that's when I met my co-founders, and they were looking at IT service as an opportunity, where if you can help employees with a prevalent need of IT service, which is employees needing help for things like, VPN troubleshooting or getting access to applications, etc., that shape of problem could get quite well addressed by messaging and natural language understanding. And that's where the very first idea of Moveworks was born, as essentially a chat-based service that lives inside tools like Slack and Skype and Microsoft Teams that allows employees to engage with underlying data and workflows that help them resolve their service issues quite fast. And since then, the rest is kind of history, so to speak, when we started the company.
Well, can I just clarify before asking my next question? So are you guys primarily an IT services, AI-driven IT services company? But is that analogous at all to ServiceNow, like a big one like that? Or
Yeah, it's a good question. That's where we started the company, was focused on IT service, because it was when we talked to CIOs, that was the most prevalent area. Since then, we've expanded into multiple employee services, because what the demand from the industry is, I want one front door for employees for consuming all services. So today, about 80% of our customers use Moveworks for IT service plus one more. The most prevalent being HR, but then finance operations, sales operations, workplace services, etc., tend to be pretty big and emerging areas for us in terms of serving employees. So the idea since then has grown into, okay, you do really good job with IT, why can't you do HR and everything else as well? And that sort of is in line with the kind of transformation our customers are looking for.
so we'll dive into later your how you achieved $100 million in annual recurring revenue. So with AI being pretty successful. So what's the relationship between Moveworks and AI? Because as you noted, you started Moveworks when AI was still in traditional AI. People weren't that excited about it. So do you guys use proprietary models, open source models, something else? What's your whole journey with AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. When we started, AI was at its early stage, but a lot of innovations were happening at the same time, and you were still, even at that time, AI was accelerating. Even though it looks like it's still accelerating, it was accelerating at that time too, where every day you would see new models and new approaches come out, which on benchmarks would outperform everything that had come before it. And it seemed to happen every day. So our perspective was simple. A lot of language models exist. Can we use those machine learning techniques to unpack an utterance? And we called it an utterance. It's now called a prompt, to understand what users are talking about. And these were things like intent detection, spelling correction, grammar alignment models, phrase alignment models, etc., to get as much information as we can out of what the user's saying. Now, fast forward to today, when ChatGPT has come out and large language models are a thing. Our entire stack uses a combination of frontier models and a lot of fine-tuned models that are proprietary in nature. So if I walk you through sort of the whole stack, there's sort of almost 6 steps to it. The first step is when the user types in a prompt, there's a set of models. Primarily, it's a frontier model that tries to understand what the user's objective is. What is the user trying to get done? So it tries to distill the goal of the user and then breaks down into a set of constituent steps that need to be followed. So it develops a plan. Now, once this plan is developed, there's a set of different models and services that get called, and some of them are proprietary, to try to fill more data in, like who's the user, how can we personalize their query, what are the right queries to generate for this plan. And then a classifier gets called to pick the right set of constituent integrations and the plugins that sit on top of these integrations that should be called to execute this plan. And a fine-tuned Llama model gets called for execution of this plan. Once this plan is executed and the results come back, then there's a frontier model that looks at this plan and attempts to figure out if this, or the summary rather, attempts to figure out if the summary is salient to the user's objective in the original plan. If not, it goes back into the planning stage and makes more calls. But if it is, it attempts to summarize it. Now we know when summaries are generated, you still need citations, you still need to make sure there's no hallucinations in there. So after that, a set of other parallel gatekeeper models get called that try to detect if the entities that are mentioned in the generated summary, are they actually present in the enterprise workflows? If a username is mentioned, is that username hallucinated or is that real? If the summary can be backed by the citations which are pulled from these different business systems. And once that test passes, that's when a summary is shown to the user or a follow-on question is asked of the user. So it's almost this collection of about 150 calls that are made. About a third of them are made to language models. The rest of them are made to various data services to enrich these calls. Of the language models calls that are made, there's one set of calls made to proprietary frontier models, and the rest of them are made to proprietary models that allow this entire reasoning architecture to work and come together.
Do you guys only use proprietary models, or do you use others like from AWS, Meta Llama, or anything else?
In terms of the frontier models, we use for Omni right now. That's just from OpenAI, and we use it on Azure as well as OpenAI.com. For fine-tuned models, we use a set of different models. We fine-tune the Llama series of models from Meta, and that gets used on AWS as well as on Azure. I think it's predominantly on Azure today, and we are going to go to AWS as well for it. And then all of our fine-tuned models, these are models like Flanty 5 and many others that get deployed on AWS, and we use them there.
Okay, so continuing on the models, I think we think that you started with LLMs around 2019. That was before the mass popularization of LLMs, but we know that they existed before. So how did you get into it so early, and what were some of the mistakes you made from being early on LLM, and which one did you use then? And so how have things changed? I think much more, much smoother and better now. And I have one other question, maybe not related, but how do you orchestrate all these calls you were talking about before? Sorry, I was just curious. Maybe you can answer that after. Yeah.
Let's talk about how we started first. And I think, they say necessity is the mother of invention. So we picked a problem where the user's prompt, which we called an utterance then, had to be understood correctly to make calls to underlying services correctly and suitably. In order to do that, the first model that came to our notice was BERT. And what BERT allowed us to do, BERT was the first model from Google that had bidirectional encoding, so you could read things forward and backwards and can understand spans of text quite well. And then it came pre-trained. So we didn't have to train it from the ground up, and we could fine-tune it with our data, the proprietary data that we had, and apply techniques. Back then, it was transfer learning was a big technique, where you can take something that's pre-trained and apply it to an adjacent domain quite successfully by just fine-tuning it with a little bit of incremental data. So you didn't need to have the whole data cost. So we were the first company after Google to deploy BERT on production, right? And what led us to there was a very sort of two things that came together. Was a lot of focus on what really matters to improve the quality of our service. And the second one was our R&D bent, where we would read a lot of papers and stay abreast with a lot of latest techniques in production, right? And then if you think about evolution from there, we were using GPT-2 2 years before it became known to the rest of the world. And we were using it mainly for synthetic data generation. Right? We were like, hey, we need to build better techniques, but how do we evaluate those techniques? Let's use GPT-2 to generate synthetic eval data and evaluate our techniques where you have sparse data from actual traffic to see how well we're performing against that traffic. So we continue to use these models and went all the way to GPT-2 and GPT-3 for the synthetic data generation. Now, the mistake, I wouldn't couch it as a mistake, but it's almost sort of no one saw the paradigm change happening so dramatically when ChatGPT came out, right? All of the technology was there. We were seeing their ability to generate synthetic data. And I think the switch that happened when ChatGPT came out for us was in March of last year, where we realized that this model can be used for reasoning. And reasoning not in sort of the pedagogical sense of, you can debate whether these models really reason or pretend to reason. But even if they pretend to reason, the practical utility of converting an objective into a set of function calls, they could achieve quite reliably in our domain. So that's when we went all in to, instead of using a stack of language models and evaluating the utterance, to building this new reasoning architecture that was more wholesale oriented around understanding the objective, developing a plan, executing function calls, and then presenting a response back to the user or iterating on it. So it wasn't, it's not so much a mistake that was made or not, but it was just sort of as technology evolved, the moment a paradigm shift actually comes into full focus, you look back and you're like, oh, we could have done that sooner because we had access to the models, but we didn't see how powerful they could be. And we couldn't quite, when you're sort of in this hockey stick phase, you really don't know how far this hockey stick stretches in real time to make some of these architectural choices. In terms of how we manage these calls, I think there's the technical aspect of managing these calls, which is relatively easy, which is we have an internal large language model gateway through which these calls get passed. And this gateway has the ability that allows us to configure where these calls go, what inputs are provided. I mean, you get to AWS or you go to Azure, it's a frontier model call or something else. And if a frontier model call fails, can we regress back to a different model to improve resilience of our overall service? So that's sort of the technical aspect. The more intriguing aspect is how do you ensure that these models, as we experiment with them and continue to bring frontiers out to our users, we went from 4 to 4 Turbo to 4 Omni, and now we're experimenting with O1, is how do you make sure that you can go from experimentation to production as quickly as possible? And we invested a lot in evaluation data sets. And what those evaluation data sets do for us is give us a level of confidence when we're testing to know if our experiment will work well on production or not. So we invest a lot of rigor in developing these evaluation data sets, against which these newer models and all of this sort of soup, the primordial soup of LLMs that's part of our reasoning architecture, gets tested and evaluated. And that's the hard part of making it work. You have to make it work reliably against production traffic. We have about 5 million users on our platform. We have some of the largest companies like Honeywell and Siemens and Northrop Grumman, et cetera, using our service, Toyota Motors. And they rely on our service as part of their business infrastructure in delivering a consistent and ever-improving quality of service. So our investment in this evaluation data sets and this underlying infrastructure really paid off and continues to pay off to stay on top of this ever-improving sort of capacity of large language models.
Yeah, super cool. So Moveworks recently announced that it surpassed $100 million in annual recurring revenue. What does that mean? How did Moveworks get here?
I think $100 million of revenue or annual recurring revenue, what that very, very few companies, very, very few startups get to this level of scale. And what that really represents for us is the value and the impact we're delivering to the world. When you think about 5 million employees, when you think about over 350 customers that we serve and the revenue that we have, it really demonstrates that as a company, we've scaled AI across the world, over 100 countries, across regions from Europe to Australia to the Americas, Canada, in a manner that delivers a lot of value and impact. And this is not, given our history, this is not, there's two types of revenue in AI. There's sort of experimental revenue where you're doing POCs, but you really don't have value to show in production. All of our revenue is actually real value that's delivered to customers in production. These are not experiments that are being run by customers to see what work and what might not work. These are long-term bets being made by our customers on us and our service. And what this also represents is without AI, there's nothing Moveworks has to offer to the world. Like if you take AI out of our stack, there's nothing we can sell to the world. Literally nothing. Like we wouldn't. There's nothing. There's only value from Moveworks comes because of AI. And then yes, there's a lot of complementary technologies that need to be built to make an application work. So that's another thing that this number represents is we're the only pure play AI application, right? If you think about others like Microsoft or GitHub, they have other services to offer and they're adding AI on top of it. We are a pure play AI company, the first one to reach that level of traction and level of value in the market.
Does that mean that you trust your ability to survive, right? Because obviously, like you mentioned, Microsoft and others have other services, right? And you are purebred AI, so to speak. And so, does that mean that is that more dangerous for you, or is that do you think that gives you in a good standing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think first of all, if you think about the very scale of our revenue, that gives us a lot of control within the company of how we want to grow and scale. Now, a lot of this revenue is only accelerating now as the demand for services like ours becomes more obvious to the world, right? Because interest rates are where they are. Uh, Businesses have a huge amount of focus on business productivity, right? They're not looking for technologies and then exploring use cases. They're trying to work use cases backwards to identify a set of technologies that can deliver against sort of the needs of the business. And in that sense, we fit the world quite well. And if you think about some of the other providers, like Microsoft or ServiceNow or others, they really are all about improving productivity of their users with their application. Okay. Our focus is improving productivity of employees and businesses who consume a plethora of these different business services. Even if you look at any business that might have hundreds of applications and maybe tens of massive applications that house a lot of data and workflows. And we're the only ones that have bi-directional connectors into all of these applications. We have a developer tool that, with agentic automation, gives these developers inside enterprises the fastest way to bring more AI use cases to life. We have a common layer of analytics that works backwards from employees to give these businesses the ability to understand how well employees are being served. So in that sense, we're like a N of one. No one else, everyone else is focused on, the bigger players are focused on improving the usability of their existing services and enhancing the value of their existing services. We're focused on allowing the business to get the most out of all of these services in one consolidated unified platform that's focused on improving employee productivity as well as business productivity.
Okay, so thanks for that. We're gonna get into agentic in a couple of questions. That stuff was super hot. But it seems like we think that Moveworks subscribes to the idea that if you're not using AI correctly, you're going to get left behind. A lot of people think that now too. What would you say that some of the ways that enterprises could better use AI technology, especially generative AI?
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement with generative AI. There's a lot of promise with generative AI. And I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of experimentation from a variety of different businesses because it is so exciting. Now, it's not so much that you're using AI incorrectly. It's what we're hearing from our customers and the world at large is there's this a CIO I was speaking to had this great quote. He goes, "We have more ideas than the money we have to spend against these ideas." So what we're trying to figure out is what are the best ideas that we should pursue. And these ideas start with a clear identification of problem statements that, when solved, would accrue value to the business. And then work backwards from it. So that's the first thing that smart business leaders are doing is instead of, buying everything under the sun, they are trying to work backwards from identifying these internal problems that give business productivity back to the business, right? Give them operating leverage, gives them some ability to sell their products better or improves productivity of certain stakeholders.
To hear the full audio podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, TuneIn, Podbean, and other popular podcast platforms.